Today, defaults squared with Tarric Brooker. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, world's latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today, Friday afternoon, I'm joined again by Tarric Brooker. Hi Tarric.
G'day Martin, how are you?
I'm pretty good, yourself?
Yeah, not too bad. A lot happening as always, but I mean that's always what's happening when we talk.
Well, I was going to say, nothing new here. It's just getting more and more complicated, and I think I may have said on the previous one, it feels like a bit of a maze, right? I'm not sure there's a way out. We're just going round and round and round and round, different paths. But the fundamental disconnects that I see between what central banks are saying, what the markets and economies are saying, what analysts are saying, and what people are experiencing on the ground seem to me to be as adverse as ever.
Well, they are. I mean, realistically, under more normal circumstances, with this level of inflation, you'd be seeing higher interest rates. You'd be seeing, we would be seeing probably even higher wages if we didn't have the various distortions going on. So, it really is something because, you've got all these central bankers saying, no, we can't raise interest rates. But if you look at some of the indicators, like the non-farm payrolls report in the US or even the initial jobless claims, it's looking more like they're at full employment already. So they should be raising rates pretty much as soon as possible.
Absolutely. And of course, the latest US CPI will be out tonight. And I was reading some different analyst views as to where that might end up. And some people are saying, well, it could be 8 or 9, or others saying it could be 4 or 5. So I think it's like playing the old game of pinning a tail on a donkey, right? I think you've got more chance of getting it right like that than actually trying to really work out what's going on.
No, it's really a monkey in a dartboard type analogy at this point. A lot of analysts have tried to predict what's going to happen, myself included. And basically, some of us have been extremely wrong, and some of us have been, extremely wrong to the upside and to the downside, because, this is really just is an unprecedented series of events.
Yeah, well, as I've used the analogy before of the old butterfly effect, right? There are so many interconnections and so many, things pulling in different directions. And in fact, I find it quite amusing that one of the Feds in the US basically stopped their GDP nowcasting because they basically concluded that they got no idea, which I think just says it all, really.
It is, and it's just a highly distortive time for data more broadly. Even if you look at, say, something that's generally looked at as a key indicator, the Chinese credit impulse. If you look at that and you go, okay, well, it's rebounding now, and that should be a good sign for commodity prices, that should be a good sign for growth, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look at the Chinese economy and you look at what's actually going on internally, you see how distorted that is compared with how it is normally. So, for example, local governments in China are now purchasing about 15% of land releases using their own money. So they're taking their own money, putting them into special purpose vehicles, using those special purpose vehicles to buy the land from themselves in order to keep the budget, their budget's balanced, not balanced, but in order to keep the revenue flowing in. And that's accounting now, just based on a very, very rough estimate I did last night, about 6% of all Chinese local government revenue, which is ridiculous. You can't just rip that out of the economy later. So, it's really, there's this behind the scenes, there are some concerning signs in that regard.
Well, it reminds me of the global financial crisis and, the fact that banks were basically selling each other's debt and repackaging it and selling it on and, financial engineering. So superficially it looked right, but we're going to have an Enron moment at some point when, in fact, somebody says, hang on a moment, tell me again why that's still valid numbers?
Well, that's the issue more broadly, but particularly with China, just in that we don't know how much off-balance sheet debt there is. We don't know how it's collateralized. We don't know what's on offer in terms of the event of default. And, just for Evergrande alone, it's estimated that they have about 1 trillion yuan worth of debt, which is, ballpark 150 billion. Sorry, 150 billion US dollars. And I mean, that's just a silly amount of money. That's more debt than most of the countries in the entire world are in. And that's just what's off the balance sheet. And then the question is, well, what have other people collateralized against that debt? Have they then taken that and they've cross collateralized it against potentially other projects, against other corporations, other businesses? Even is it wrapped up even with Chinese local government and some of their more dodgy dealings in order to keep the revenue flowing? And the truth is, we don't know. And that's the real problem in all of this, because we could get quite an unfortunate surprise at some point, because no one really knows.
No, that's right. And the point about this is that you won't know until it goes wrong, by which time it's too late, right? That's the difficulty.
It is, but I mean, I will say one thing for the Chinese Communist Party. At least they're keeping their powder dry. They haven't wasted it on bailing out Evergrande like what probably would have happened in the West. I mean, can you imagine a developer in the West with, 300, 400 billion US dollars in debts and liabilities going bust? I mean, everyone would be panicking. Everyone would be running around like their hair was on fire. There'd be congressmen and senators ringing up and having a good old cry to the Fed that they need to be saved and constituents' jobs and yada blah blah. But I got to hand it to them. At least they're allowing a relatively sort of free market solution. And after this, the normal programming of me putting my boot in China will probably resume.
Talking about putting the boot in, I think we should move on to the charts, because people, of course, are here for your charts, Tarric.
Okay.
That's the only reason why they're watching. So why don't we switch across and lead us through your analysis?
No worries. Alrighty. Well, we've got a nice little cartoon here from investing.com. I especially enjoy their little cartoons they put out every couple of days.
They are brilliant, absolutely. In fact, I used that one earlier on my show. It's brilliant.
No, I love it. Okay. Now, in the news recently, there's been a lot of talk about, the Biden administration is solving the port crisis. They've done such a fantastic job. There's only X number of ships. I think they believe at last count 38 container ships waiting off the ports of LA and Long Beach. And, aren't they doing a fantastic job to solve the supply chain crisis? And the answer in reality is no. What they've done is they've changed the rules around how many ships are allowed to loiter near the ports of LA and Long Beach. The reasoning would being, at least at a local level, that they're having issues with little oil slicks and pollution and stuff like that from having such a large number of vessels waiting there. Now, in reality, there's actually more ships waiting than ever. They're just waiting further offshore, or they're waiting down off the coast of Mexico, just south of that area, in order to not be counted in this. So it's a real fudging of the data, which is just sort of like, the classic, lies and statistics type approach to things, which is unfortunate, because I think Americans and people more broadly deserve to know the truth of the matter, and that it may go on for quite a bit longer than the government tells them it will.
I love the idea of a ship loitering with intent offshore, right, and not being counted in the numbers, but it's still there. It's still needing to be unloaded, so it's not really changed anything at all, has it? It is remarkable. It
is remarkable, and part of the problem as well is that this is only one. So don't get me wrong, it's a rather large part of the problem. But once you actually get the containers off the ship, and you are talking about, probably well over 1 million containers here, it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of time to process them, to get them to where they're going in wherever it is in the United States, whether it's by road or rail, however many warehouses or logistics hubs they need to pass through. So really, the supply chain crisis in terms of the actual bottleneck issue isn't really going to have peaked until well after you've seen the number of ships at LA and Long Beach peak and start to decline, and then there's also the fact that of potential disruptions in China. I mean, some of the largest ports in the world, which are located near China's manufacturing hubs, are reporting COVID cases, which could once again bring loading to a halt and create even more problems well into the new year.
And of course, you've got to understand that the ships that are queued in one place aren't able to move goods somewhere else. So basically, this whole thing is like a spider's web. It just goes on and on and on, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it just keeps feeding through, because, if you've got a ship, the average wait time at this point is about 3 weeks. So if you think about how many times a ship plies its way across the Pacific on that particular route, how much time is lost? How many deliveries won't be made because they're sitting there waiting for it to be unloaded, like at one end and then at the other end? So, you're losing a lot of time and a lot of shipping capacity, and that could start to impact other places. And you've seen that even with them jacking up rates between China and Australia, because these routes between the US and China are so profitable. They're like, well, why would we send it to Australia? We're going to have to jack up the prices.
Yeah. Well, you and I have both said a few times, Tarric, that this isn't something that's just going to get fixed anytime soon. So we've got to assume that the supply chain disruptions will continue and actually could get worse rather than better because, as you mentioned, the COVID thing is still there. And, the latest variants of that particular virus is also still causing significant problems.
It is. And part of the problem is even if we do get the best possible outcome with Omicron, that it is a lot less severe, that it does spread more rapidly, that there is some form of broad-based natural immunity on offer at a very minimal cost to society. China's zero COVID stance is going to continue for the foreseeable future into the new year. So even if that is proven down the road, in the short term, if Omicron does spread into China and it is a lot more contagious, then we're going to potentially see some issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And interesting is, because in some places in Europe, they're locking down again. The UK have brought more laws in to basically restrict movement. Now, some would say that's political, because there's many other things going on in the UK. But yeah, I think this isn't over yet. And I remember we had a show a few months ago when we said anybody who's thinking that COVID is going to disappear in a few weeks, completely wrong. And I'm afraid that we were right. It's still bubbling along.
Well, we've actually been having this conversation since about July last year, when we said that when everyone was saying, but case numbers are down, things are getting better, and this was the height of the European summer, and we said no, well, I think we should be cautious. And then the same thing happened again, and we said once again we should be cautious. And caution should really be the order of the day here, particularly when, as you say, there are political factors at work here. Now, whether or not all this stuff is warranted is a debate for another day. But at the end of the day, the political decisions are going to be made anyway. So that's really something we've got to watch for as we do head for what was last year's seasonal peak, particularly in the US and in Europe.
Well, I've got another observation, which I can't prove, but it's just quite convenient, isn't it, that just as central banks were almost being arm-locked into lifting rates, suddenly the next variant of COVID pops up, and now they're saying, oh, hang on, we've got this other issue to deal with. So it gives them a get-out-of-jail card.
Well, it's certainly being used that way. It's being, even the market sees it to that way to a degree. The fact that Boris Johnson did reintroduce various curbs in the UK has been seen by the market as we are pushing rate hikes back. Earlier this week, the market was pricing in roughly a 70% chance of rates being hiked this year in the UK, and now that's basically well below half. So it is being interpreted in that fashion, but I think that's just the market seeing uncertainty. And the truth is, with Omicron, I think the jury is very much still out. There is some, obviously some promising preliminary evidence, but there's also some rather negative preliminary evidence as well. So, to be honest, it's beyond my ability to forecast with any accuracy. So, it's just one of those things that we're going to have to wait and see.
Absolutely, but it is, being used as a very convenient alibi to perhaps do a little bit more quantitative easing and keep those rates a bit lower and keep bond purchases going, etc., etc. So it is a very convenient factor in the thinking. And of course, as you say, the markets are pretty much banking on the central banks bailing everybody out for as long as it takes, for wherever it needs, because people, they know that companies can't fail and businesses can't fail, and even individuals probably can't fail because central banks will bail everybody out until they don't.
Well, without going too far into a tangent, recently the ECB said that they were considering the possibility of continuing QE while raising interest rates, and that's something that we've discussed previously. I think it was a few months ago. And I think in some ways that may be the course that they end up taking, because, okay, it's going to cost them more to service their debts, but they're just going to buy more of the debts. I mean, if you look at the scheduled bond purchases for next year by the European Central Bank, they're going to buy more than 100% of net issuance. So there is potentially a scenario in which they actually reduce the servicing costs, the overall servicing costs of European debt, while hiking interest rates. I mean, it's a really, really strange, sort of messed up situation that shouldn't make any sense, but, we're through the looking glass at this point.
Well, then, of course, then that takes you into deeper negative rates, et cetera, et cetera. And if you actually overlay digital currencies in that too, so that they can actually put money straight into your central bank digital currency, they can do this quantitative easing thing forever. And it may not necessarily solve anything, but it's still conceivable that this quantitative easing process could actually be there. And, as you say, rates going up at the same time, that would be a remarkable situation if in fact that's what we got to, not least because of course the cost of the debt in terms of interest payments would be much higher than currently. So they're going to have to do a lot more quantitative easing to be able to actually service the debt because rates are going up.
Well, I think that's one of the key things at this point is that, and this may ruffle a few feathers, but I'm no stranger to that. The thing is that they don't really care about what happens to households on a more individual basis. They care about what happens in terms of the broader knock-on effects. But if they can keep doing QE forever and they can keep throwing support at the economy, eventually you reach a point where they don't need to support asset prices anymore. Because if anything does go wrong, they'll just keep throwing more and more money at it incrementally until they manage to right the ship sufficiently that the economy's okay. So it's that real sort of feedback loop of MMT, of what's basically MMT, just keeping the economy going, even if asset prices fall to bits. So I think that could create some rather interesting scenarios down the road because you raise interest rates, you're going to see issues in terms of falling asset prices if they rise significantly.
Absolutely. Well, we better go on to the next slide. We've only got one slide
should.
so far. Otherwise, this will be a 4-hour program. So pick up the next slide.
Part 2 coming next week. Okay, this is a nice little illustration of basically that supply chain issues in the US aren't really getting all that much better, and in a lot of ways they're getting a lot worse. And I mean, really, it just sort of speaks for itself, and just goes over what we've already said. Just that things are not just going to go away, and that these things are going to persist well into next year.
And it doesn't underscore again that this isn't just at the docks, it's right the way through the systems and processes, right into the heart of the economy. And that's the point. And it's almost a logarithmic effect because, of course, the more bits that go wrong, it triggers more problems elsewhere, and so it goes on.
It does indeed. Now, this is an interesting one about rates in the US. Basically, the Fed is seeing rates rise all the way back up to 2.5%, the US federal funds rate, but the market is predicting them to top out around about 1.25%. And we've already seen an inversion of the yield curve, pointing to basically slowing growth in the next couple of years. So, we are going to see this period of high inflation. We are going to see this period of relatively strong growth, which is frankly pathetic once you factor in the level of stimulus, but that's not a very popular take these days. And you're just seeing basically what them forecasting that once this stimulus feeds through, once this mini boom that we're in concludes, that basically the economy isn't going to be as strong going into the future. And if you actually look at the yield, the Canadian yield curve in particular, that's already pricing in rate cuts towards the end of 2023, even though it's pricing in an aggressive rate hike cycle for 2022.
And it's interesting, Morgan Stanley's come out today and said they're predicting 5 rate rises from the Fed over the next few months. But yeah, you're right. And this thing about the yield curve is really important, right? If you compare the 10-2, it's gone pretty much flat. It's got way flatter than previously because the forward expectation of future growth is actually coming off. And that is what people need to stop and have a think about, right? So we've got all this stimulus, we've got these really low interest rates. We're now having the central bank talking about lifting rates, and yet the expectation is that future growth will be lower than people were expecting previously. It's not working, is it?
No, I mean, we've thrown all this money at the economy. I mean, one of the things I think is really interesting is that they've started to just really put a heavy focus on nominal GDP in the US media. And they're like, look how much bigger nominal GDP is. And then you account for inflation and you go, oh, no, it's actually really, really, really crap. Like the actual US GDP growth in terms of pre-pandemic and now in real terms is only a little bit over 1%, which is frankly not all that impressive considering that they've thrown, a deficit of about 27% of GDP at the economy over the last 2 years. And they're going to throw another 1.2 trillion at the economy next year, not including future stimulus bills, which are no doubt going to crop up between now and then. So yeah, I don't think it's that impressive of a recovery in relative terms. And I think that's something that really needs to be kept in mind as the likes of Jim Cramer and the rest of them all harp on about how this is the best economy ever.
Well, that's right. So, if inflation is rising, GDP might go up a bit, but if it's not real, but nominal, if you look at nominal terms, it's hardly going anywhere. And again, I remind everybody how much money has been thrown through the system and how much quantitative easing has been used to prop up the economy for a long, long time. I mean, if you look at it just on a purely return on investment perspective, it doesn't pass muster, does it?
No, not really. I mean, the thing that I think is interesting is even if you just rip out something simple, something relatively innocuous, say like HELOC, which is home equity loans in America, which is basically, or in Australian terms, equity mate. People pulling out equity from their homes in order to fund consumption. If you pull that out of the US economy over the last 2 years, in real terms, growth has basically gone nowhere. So you've got an economy that's been powered by stimulus and the wealth effect. And if you take one or potentially both away, it doesn't look so pretty.
Sounds a bit like the Australian economy, right? Because effectively our economy has been absolutely supported by house price growth, low interest rates, government stimulus, etc., the wealth effect. But it is, I'm afraid, artificial. So yeah, this is not real good grounding for the future of any economy in the world, is it?
No, unfortunately, but that's increasingly what they're turning to.
Yep.
Now, this is another interesting one. Basically, US investors are buying the dip in stock prices in absolutely record numbers. There is this belief that you cannot lose, that it's going to keep going up forever and ever, and this can be quite dangerous if and when the market reverses, because you're going to end up with a lot of people who are trapped, a lot of people who've leveraged up. And you've already seen that in the crypto space where people have taken up, big leverage. They haven't fully understood the risks and they've got quite badly burned. And that's a really concerning thing, especially because you are seeing this very, very strong push for households to try and find these get rich quick schemes, to try and invest, to basically, make up for the fact that that in some cases, in real terms, their incomes are falling. And it's also the fact that some of them still have those stimulus checks lying around. So it's like, well, I may as well invest it. And it's not just, I'm going to buy some, value dividend stocks either. It's, how about I plow it all into Tesla calls?
Absolutely. And of course, the distribution of new investors and inexperienced investors as a total of the investment pool has gone through the roof. Not least because of people like Robinhood and other, cheap platforms, but also, as you say, the stimulus checks, which means that people are actually able to risk a bit. I don't think many people actually understand the risk that they're taking with investments at the moment, with where the markets are.
Oh, it's unfortunate because this is what happened in the run-up to the end of the dot-com bubble. You saw that retail, really started to take the reins of the market, and that was, shortly before things went pear-shaped. But obviously, you didn't have the Fed pumping billions of dollars of liquidity into the market back then either.
No, the Fed will save everybody's back until they don't.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the Fed may go from being people's best friend to its worst enemy if we do see that 5 rate hikes they're talking
Absolutely.
about.
Yeah.
Okay, please forgive the rather pixelated nature of the chart. It's the best one I could find, but basically this shows that basically the Nasdaq, and this is not quite as true as the S&P 500, but it's not far off either. This basically just shows that the Nasdaq's big five stocks are really, really running the show at this point. That the actual broader index peaked well basically at the start of this year and is actually down around about 40% since then. So it's really quite interesting to see this huge divergence in something. We're meant to be in this like raving bull market. Everything's meant to be fantastic. But the truth is we're just pumping more and more cash into the big five, and it at least on paper, it doesn't make for a very strong market.
Well, the fascinating thing about that, and it's a brilliant slide, is of course that more and more those few very large tech stocks are dominating all the action, which is not surprising given their footprint and given, of course, the expectation. But in fact, today, analysts are saying that Apple is still undervalued, and with the iPhone sales that are going on, it's going to be even better ahead. At what point do these really big stocks start, though, correcting? Can they really go on growing at the rate of growth that we've seen? And I actually think we should be thinking here not just about absolute numbers, but also what the regulatory environment is likely to be, because it seems to me that there's a little bit of a turn in the weather here in terms of how some of the governments around the world are interacting with some of these really big players. And if in fact the regulatory environment starts to change, those growth rates might well be checked, and if so, that's going to have a huge impact on the market.
Well, there's also the anti-monopoly side of things as well. I mean, you look at Google, you look at Facebook, you look at the power that they wield in terms of advertising, in terms of their, as particularly with Google, in terms of their relative monopoly on information, on how that information is then provided to the public, and as things become more combative and more difficult in that regard, politically and socially. And you're seeing that now even with like deleted Twitter accounts, deleted Facebook accounts. It's going to become more and more of a political landmine, which is going to, I think, perhaps not force, but encourage politicians, to become more involved. And given the allegations of bias against the right that is, sort of relatively commonplace in the media now, in the legacy media, in terms of the way things are online. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see a Republican-led House and Congress pushing for various limits on their power going forward if they do win the midterms, and indeed if Republicans retake the White House at the next presidential election.
Well, there was some interesting reporting earlier on that the Biden White House was very pro some of these big organisations, and it'll be interesting to see whether they have to detune that a little bit. But as you say, the other side of politics over in the US would definitely be more muscular, I think, in terms of their potential intervention. And even in Australia, of course, there's still quite a lot of talk about we should do more here, and we should, control some of those big players. So I think it's really interesting. But, it's just worth reflecting the rest of the NASDAQ, 40% down or wherever it is from its highs. That's scary stuff.
Well, like they say, it's fine if you own the index. If you own individual stocks, you better own the lucky ones.
Well, I'll also make one other point. Of course, this shows you the stupidity of indices, right? The fact is that the aggregation of different elements to create an index is all very artificial, right? And okay, so if you're tracking the index, fine, but it is interesting. It's a bit like house prices. House price trends, right, are pretty meaningless at the aggregate level. But as soon as you drop down, you realise that it's not uniformly spread. And I suppose it's a question of, is it better to select a few value stocks and go with them? Well, it looks as though that would be the answer here. Or buy the index. If you buy the index, you might be fine. But the question is, if it changes and you're in the wrong stocks, then you can be significantly hit. So following the index gives you a little bit of protection, but it may also mean you miss out on some of the upside.
Indeed. It's definitely a complicated thing, and I mean, I guess that's why we don't provide individual financial advice on this show.
Absolutely.
Now, this one will probably piss a lot of people off, and for that I do apologise. But here we are. Basically, the people of Britain, about 45% believe that things won't return to normal ever after because of COVID. And I mean, whether they're going to be right or not, I don't know. It's impossible to tell. I mean, with something like a virus that's consistently evolving, and even the political side of things, which is consistently evolving as well. You could see election cycles, and then all of a sudden, the people who were in charge, who were responsible for lockdowns, all of a sudden someone comes in and said, we're not going to do any more lockdowns and things could be different. But more broadly, people are sort of giving up hope that that's going to occur on, anytime soon. And it's something that we really need to keep an eye on in terms of markets and in terms of the economy, because this could change spending patterns and the way people go about things significantly, which could feed into markets and the economy more broadly.
But it's an interesting concept. Was there ever a normal, right? I mean, okay, you can say people saying we're never going back to pre-COVID, but I'm not sure that actually normal was particularly normal even then. We've got some sort of new normal now, and we'll probably have a different normal ahead. So, the fact is things are changing and things will continue to change. I think it's highly unlikely that we're going to see the same freedoms that we perhaps once had. And by the way, that's partly because of the virus, but also partly because of the government responses and government interventions. And it seems to me that governments have got much more muscular over the last year or two, simply because of the fact that they've realised that they can, and the populace seems to be quite happy for them to do so. I have a real problem with that personally, and my own view is I wish that governments would get off our backs and let us get on with life as normal.
Well, forgive me if I get a little bit animated and angry here, but I'm really quite sick of it, to be honest with you. The idea was that we were meant to give up our freedoms, and the government was meant to be understanding, and all this other stuff. And I hear these stories and these accounts from people about the government's complete lack of understanding, about people not being able to see loved ones who are dying, about people who were unable to go to funerals of their parents, of their children. I mean, what sort of insanely stupid government does that has absolutely no mechanism for compassion and a system that encourages them to have no compassion? And the thing, I get that government, it can be this big faceless, this big faceless entity that lacks empathy, that lacks understanding, and it's up to us as a populace to hold them accountable for their failings. But instead of holding them accountable for their failings, and I'm not just saying Scott Morrison or Daniel Andrews, pretty much all of them, people are supporting them. People support what they've done. And I cannot, in good conscience, do that, knowing how many people were denied the ability to be at their loved one's bedside, even if they had to stand there in a freaking hazmat suit to hold their hand as their partner or their child or their grandparent died. And it's an absolute joke that they couldn't. And I think that it's just so sad that people just support these governments so readily and hold them almost not accountable at all for what has transpired.
Well, I agree, and I have to say that the mainstream media generally have done a very, very bad job at holding the governments of all sizes and shades to account on this, and they just seem to be sort of parroting the government propaganda and just repeating it. And I've got a problem with that, right? There has to be a more critical analytic function in our media, it seems to me, because we have to hold our parliamentarians and governments to account. We elect them, but we actually expect them to look after our interests, not their own interests. And as you say, there have been some really, really horrible decisions taken without anybody thinking about the real consequences at the human level. And that's the thing that I get frustrated about, right? There are real people here being impacted by all of these decisions, and real lives being impacted. And yet we seem to be working in sort of meta level where effectively individuals don't matter. It's the sort of the overall architecture of the solution. That top-down approach is, for me, quite sickening.
Well, the thing is that there is the top-down approach, unless you're a famous football player or unless you're a movie star. If you're a movie star and you want to come in and you want to come into Australia, you want to avoid quarantine, you want to do all this stuff, plenty of footy players have gone across, footy players, cricket players have all gone across borders, while the rest of us were all stuck and people couldn't even be at their dying loved one's bedside. And I mean, it's a joke. But people aren't even angry about it. They just go, oh, yeah, well, whatever. I love insert politician here. They've done a great job. And I'm just sitting there going, oh, my God. It's just you and I and the community here, that unfortunately I think most people don't really care. And that's as deeply disturbing as it is sad.
Well, it's interesting. Do they care, or do they actually feel so disempowered that they don't think it's worth making a fuss? I think it might be the latter rather than the former, right? And I would remind people that our election is going to be coming up sometime over the next few months. And, maybe the decisions we take at that next election could be significant in terms of shaping the future trajectory of the country. The question is, is everybody dancing the same tune, and is everybody basically going the same way, or are there differences? We'll see about that. But I do feel very frustrated at the lack of real engagement around some of these critical issues. I talk a lot about liberty and freedom and valuing those things and holding, the banks and the regulators and the politicians to account. But I feel a bit like a lone voice on some of this stuff.
Yeah, unfortunately, that seems to be the case at times. I mean, obviously not a completely lone voice. There are obviously other people out there behind you, people like Steve Keen, for example, who you've had on your show regularly, and there are others. But yeah, there's just I don't know. I don't think there's an easy solution there. I think it's a really complex problem. But rather than continuing my rant, I think I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, this is the European Producer Price Index versus the EU CPI, and it's not a pretty picture. And this is being reflected around the world in really pretty much everywhere. Australia is lagging in this regard quite significantly, but whether or not that we'll see a major catch up, we'll have to see next year. But you look at Germany's Producer Price Index is at its highest level since the Korean War. China's is at its highest level since the mid 1990s, and if even a fraction of this inflation that's in the manufacturing sector feeds into consumer prices, we're going to see some fairly major problems, and it's going to be very, very hard for central banks to continue to parrot transitory or humps or whatever it is they're coming out with this week.
Well, Powell has pretty much ridden off the transitory, squashed it off his list, right? He's now saying you've got to start thinking about it. So, and that's partly because, again, in the US, the PPI is, extremely strong. And of course, that is an early indicator because those prices then flow through into the other ones downstream. And if it then flows into wages, then you've got the problem. And, the chances are we're going to see some of that, I think, flowing through. And pretty much wherever you look, in pretty much every economy, you have that same diversity and dichotomy between the CPI and the PPI, but often the CPI is lagged or indeed is actually myopically presented, which means it's not telling you the full story.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, because if you look at something, say, like the University of Michigan Consumer Confidence Index for the US, that has been screaming inflation for months now. It topped out months and months and months ago, and it's been screaming inflation. Consumers saying it's not a good time to buy a car, it's not a good time to buy a house, it's not a good time to make a major purchase because things are getting expensive. And basically they knew that long before the CPI started registering these huge big numbers. And I mean, all I can say is that on tonight's data is going to be very, very interesting, because if it does come in hot again, Powell is going to have some very, very interesting choices to make next year, because we're going to start to see the beginning of the midterm election cycle, the fundraising, the primary season, and a lot of people are going to start throwing their weight around because the Democrats are in a bad place and they're going to need to make a comeback somehow, and they're not going to take the blame for the inflation that them and the Republicans helped create. So who are you going to blame? Jerome.
Well, he's been renewed, so, presumably that means that he can carry on a bit longer. But remember that Jerome Powell, of course, is very much pro the US dollar and, pro a certain set of parameters which are very narrow in terms of actually supporting the US economy. And, it wonders whether some of this is going to get found out now, if in fact they have to start turning the ratchet up. And he did say in his last couple of speeches that, it's now time to focus on price and price stability, which would suggest that all this focus on, in full employment and wages growth might have to be detuned, which suggests that maybe rates will have to rise. On the other hand, of course, we've got the Omicron, so that's going to give him a get-out-of-jail card, as I said earlier on. So we'll see how it plays out.
That is going to be the major factor. I mean, if it does turn out to be relatively mild, even if it isn't a pandemic-ending variant, as they're talking about, it being basically extremely mild and whatever, but if it does just turn out to be another variant that's not terribly different than what we already have, I think it could get quite tough for Powell early next year. And I think that if this evidence keeps coming that the US economy is already at or near full employment, and you do start to see some of these big wage rises and these strikes coming through where these major companies, say like John Deere, the people who make the tractors and the farm equipment, they gave their staff huge pay rises because of strike action. And if that does start to become a trend and you do start to see that sort of 1970s feedback loop, we may see rates rise a lot sooner than a lot of people are thinking. And some people have suggested it could be as early as late Q1 next year. And I don't think that they're necessarily wrong in that conclusion if we do see the right combination of factors.
And also watch the dollar, the DXY, right? Because it's been growing up quite strong. And, I'm pretty sure that Powell is still on a strong dollar trajectory. And that's something else just to bear in mind in terms of seeing some of these things moving.
Well, and the thing that's interesting in that regard is so is Yellen. Yellen is very much on the strong dollar side of things. And purely from a political perspective, a strong dollar would at least provide some benefit to the US consumer because it would blunt the inflationary pressures. So that may be a political consideration. You may see them, talking up the dollar, jawboning it a bit higher than they otherwise would. So it's going to be interesting to watch.
Absolutely. Yeah, watch with interest.
Now, this is an interesting one that's basically been repeated around the world. On the left-hand side, you have sentiment amongst investors. And unsurprisingly, they've been riding this wave of liquidity, these rising indices around the world. Well, actually not around the world, but they've been they've been enjoying quite a happy time of things. And then on the right, you've got one that is done by analysts at key German companies, insurance companies, industry, etc. And you're seeing this big bifurcation between the two, whereas in say 2019 you saw that they were both roughly in line with each other. The fact that you are seeing this huge flood of liquidity, this huge level of government support, you're seeing this big bifurcation between the two. Industry is generally more bearish, and sentiment has started to roll over again to sort of 2019 levels when the German economy wasn't really in the most fantastic of condition. But investors are still quite bullish. So I think that eventually one of them is going to be proven wrong.
Well, as I said, investors are just expecting central banks to bail them out all the time. And it's interesting that the business confidence index in Australia has just come out, is down a bit. So it seems to me to be replicated in quite a number of areas where people closer to the real economy are less confident than others, but investors are still believing in the never-ending largesse from central banks supporting the value of stocks and shares and bonds and everything. So it's all going to be fine because the central banks will never let it not be fine.
Well, I mean, it's a one trick strategy, but it's worked so far. So I guess we'll just see how much longer it keeps working.
Absolutely, longer than people think, I suspect.
Oh, wouldn't surprise me. And I think that is actually the end of charts for this week.
Terrific. Okay, you want to put yourself back on full screen?
Yep, done.
Let me just get rid of you and the mini you. Yeah, now Tarric, that's great. Thank you very much for those slides. Some very, very powerful points there, and it does, I think, show very, very significantly and importantly just how fragile things are, and how, you know, the question of defaults like Evergrande and elsewhere, you know, are all flowing in, but also all of the other uncertainties that are there at the moment. And it was interesting that in that context, of course, Phil Lowe came out this week talking about central bank digital currencies, and the Treasury is now looking at retail central bank digital currencies, right? I just want to remind a few people that central bank digital currencies are a necessary prerequisite to be able to take interest rates negative and to be able to do UBI and all those wonderful things that people would perhaps want central banks to do, right? So it's really important in the context of what we've been discussing to say, understand how central bank digital currencies can play into this agenda.
I think you make an important point, and just on central bank digital currencies more broadly, they are arguably the greatest tool for control in the modern history of finance, really. You know, the ability to be able to control what someone spends, when they spend it, and what they spend it on.
Yep.
You know, I mean, say vaccine mandates for a moment. Now, I don't want to get into the full rigmarole. I mean, people know how I feel about them. They can see that on Twitter. But looking at the purely from what was accepted, say 3 years ago, compared with what is accepted now, how much control has been given up, how much power we've given government. Is it really that hard to imagine the power creep with central bank digital currencies occurring over the next 5 or 10 years as they're introduced, as they're popularized? And, you know, I mean, even say, look at New Zealand. If you're a young person, you're not allowed to buy a cigarette anymore. You know, once this new ban is introduced. Now, I don't like smoking. You know, I'm not a fan of it. I don't like the smell of it when I buy a new car and someone's been a smoker, and it stinks like that for weeks until I get the smell out. But at the end of the day, it's someone's choice, and people have a right to make bad choices. You know, if that is the way they see it. You know, if I see it as a bad choice, that's fine. It's that they're free to make that choice. You're free to gamble. You're free to drink. You're free to do whatever it is that you want, as long as you're not hurting anybody else. But in terms of, you know, like, you think about what they did to save the economy, what other crazy crap they're going to come up with central bank digital currency?
Yeah, well, the point of all of this is, it seems to me that there is a personal accountability, responsibility, and empowerment thing here, right? And I've, you know, long enough to know what things were like in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and 2000s, right? And it seems to me that we have given up so much, and we've basically thrown more and more of the controlling ability towards central governments and local governments, and, you know, the COVID was take us further down the road. And I just remind people about China, where effectively you have social scores, you have a central bank digital currency that effectively is slowly replacing the cryptocurrencies in China. But if you are not accredited in the right way, you can't do certain things. And that is, for me, a real warning sign, right? And yet we seem to be naively walking into it, accepting the digitalization of everything, accepting that, you know, the guys upstairs know better and, you know, are looking after our best interests. And I would simply say to people, hang on a moment, you know, just think about where this can lead. And, you know, I have to say, books like 1984 and, you know, A Brave New World, there's a lot of truth in those, right? A lot of truth. And it's actually incremental removal of freedoms and liberties that takes us to that end game. And unfortunately, in the journey, quite often you don't notice until you look back and think, hang on, where have we come from, right? And yet, of course, there are more and more opportunities potentially to do more. And central bank digital currency, for me, is something right at the heart of that continued removal of freedoms and individual responsibility and accountability. And that's why there needs to be a very strong debate about that, not just a superficial economic discussion, right? This is about the future of liberty, the future of individual freedoms, and indeed the future of our society.
Well, the thing that gets me in all this is I've been in countries where on Monday I was allowed to say whatever I wanted, where I could have my say on politics, I could criticize the government, I could say whatever I wanted, and that would be fine. And then by the end of the week, I couldn't. And if I did, I could have ended up in a re-education camp.
Yep.
And I've seen that happen with my own eyes. I've seen the tanks on the streets and the troops on the streets. And I know that people are going to say, oh, well, no, that's completely different. That's completely different. But we shouldn't be giving up our freedoms, in that way. Freedoms, that were meant to be, temporarily removed should be returned, as soon as possible. And there should be a roadmap provided by government, by authorities, by the health service, to say you will get all of your freedoms back. You will be able to do everything, and we're not going to keep all of this check-in, all this other crap. You're going to be able to go back to normal once we have set a time that this is over, and that what we are doing is appropriate. But that's just it's not happening. And I think, without going too far down the rabbit hole, at the end of the day, we are living in the waning years of the system. We are going to have a pension crisis at some point if we, without some fairly major changes. We're going to have all sorts of problems going down the road. And instead of just accepting that we're going to have an issue, taking the pain, dealing with it, and moving on, we've instead created a situation where there's even more risk. And then when it inevitably blows up, even more pain. And asset prices and housing markets are a perfect example of that. We could have let it blow up in 2008. You'd be able to, buy a house now, for $400,000, $500,000, $600,000. But no, that couldn't happen. We had to protect. We had to prevent short-term pain. And I call me crazy, but I don't think that should be the objective. That's not the government's job to prevent anyone from ever experiencing hardship. It's their job to provide a safety net. Not to transfer the pain and suffering from one demographic, which is a larger voting bloc, onto another demographic just because.
Yep, absolutely. Well, it goes back to, what is society there for, right? What is government there for, right? And do governments really get elected to do what they currently do, or are they being elected for what I would argue they should be there, which is to enable and facilitate, the greater good of society? Because at the moment, I'm afraid they've lost the plot, and unfortunately, other people have too. So it's interesting times. Tarric, we've hit our time already, and we we haven't even got started. But I want to say thank you for your time today. Some really, really important points there. And we might try and do one last show before the end of the year, and maybe do a bit of a retrospect on what we learnt and what the next year looks like before we get to the start of the new year.
Yeah, sounds good.
Thanks very much. See you later.
Catch you later, mate.
Bye.
Bye.